Sup, Square Dudes? So we're back here. We're gonna wrap up our the discussion and our education, learning, and our just fun we're having with the muscular system. So we're gonna do that by discussing ATP production within a myofiber. So muscles obviously need lots of ATP to contract. Obviously, need lots of mitochondria to do that. But we're looking here at the different types of methods that produce ATP within a myofiber. So there's three different types we're going to discuss: creatine phosphate system, glycolysis, and oxidative phosphorylation. What the hell are we waiting for? Let's get to it. So creatine phosphate system, also called the creatine phosphagen system or phosphagen system, it's going to be the we'll actually see here. So there's one ATP produced per one creatine phosphate molecule here. So what happens is you take the phosphate off the creatine phosphate, and then what's left is creatine and ATP. So you have the one ATP produced per one creatine phosphate molecule. So this is a very fast process. So it happens very quickly. Boom, 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 boom. But it is inefficient and it is short lasting, the ATP, since only one ATP is produced here. So the energy from the creatine phosphate system, the ATP produced, really only lasts about 10 to 20 seconds. And also, this creatine phosphate system of producing ATP within a myofiber is anaerobic, so no oxygen is required. So no oxygen is required with creatine phosphate system. Now, taking a little bit longer to kick in, if you will, is glycolysis. So all these different ways to produce ATP, they're all happening at the same time, except the obviously creatine phosphate happens first, and then we'll see the glycolysis, and then we'll see the oxidative phosphorylation takes the longest. But glycolysis is the breakdown of glucose into pyruvic acid and 2 ATP. So with glycolysis, instead of one ATP being produced per one creatine phosphate, there's 2 ATP produced per one glucose. So a little more ATP production here. The glucose can come from from glycogen stores in the body or the glucose in the blood. So either one, glucose will be broken down into pyruvic acid and 2 ATP. So this process, glycolysis of the way of producing ATP, is also anaerobic. So no O2, no oxygen is required here, and it is pretty fast acting once again, but it is short lasting, so it's pretty inefficient. The ATP really only lasts 2 to 3 minutes. So we got the creatine phosphate kicking in first, and then the glycolysis. And last but certainly not least is oxidative phosphorylation. So for oxidative phosphorylation to produce ATP, we can use byproduct of glycolysis, which is pyruvic acid. For oxidative phosphorylation, fatty acids can be used, amino acids can be used, nucleotides can be used. It's pretty much ATP central. Oxidative phosphorylation is 32 to 34 ATP can be produced per nutrient. So per pyruvic acid, per fatty acid, per amino acid, per nucleotide, 32 to 34 ATP. So blows the rest of the other ATP production methods within a myofiber out of the water, but it does take longer to kick into. So they all have kind of their pros and cons, if you will, or their differences between them. So oxidative phosphorylation, it's kind of in the name. It is aerobic, so the limiting factor here is oxygen. Oxygen is required for this process to work. So without oxygen, oxidative phosphorylation is not producing ATP. So it doesn't matter how much pyruvic acid you have in your body. If there's no oxygen, you're not going to produce ATP through oxidative phosphorylation. So it is slower to kick in, but it is longer lasting here. So to touch on the concept of the no O2, no oxygen in the body a little bit farther, that's what lactic acid actually is. So when cells have inadequate oxygen, the pyruvic acid can't be used for oxidative phosphorylation, so lactic acid is the result. So whenever there's oxygen, or when oxygen isn't available to produce ATP out of pyruvic acid, if pyruvic acid builds up without there being oxygen to turn it into energy, essentially into ATP, the result's going to be lactic acid. So this is there's a scientific reason why massages are beneficial, or doing a roller to kind of loosen up the muscles. It increases blood flow which obviously in turn blood has oxygen, so it increases oxygen flow, which decreases the buildup or removes the buildup of lactic acid, or of the pyruvic acid, excuse me. So increasing oxygen to the cells will decrease the amount of pyruvic acid, which will decrease the amount of lactic acid as well too. So in oxidative phosphorylation, well, actually, I mean, in all of our cells, but whenever we're utilizing oxidative phosphorylation, there's this thing called myoglobin. Myoglobin is a protein inside of a muscle that stores oxygen. So the reason there's myoglobin is that protein that stores oxygen within the muscle. That oxygen obviously is needed for oxidative phosphorylation. So it's kind of a backup method so we have some stores, a vault, if you will, of oxygen, so we can produce ATP, whether it's from pyruvic acid, whether it's from amino acid, fatty acid, or nucleotides. So if oxygen's available, there's pretty much endless ATP production with oxidative phosphorylation, excuse me. So to run back through, creatine phosphate system, 1 ATP produced per 1 creatine phosphate. Very fast process, but short lasting, lasts about 10 to 20 seconds. It's anaerobic. So analogy for this is think of, obviously, in a legal state, think of this system as the rapidity of somebody puffing on a joint. So it's real quick, real fast acting, but also isn't going to last that long. So glycolysis is the breakdown of glucose into pyruvic acid and 2 ATP. So 2 ATP are produced for 1 glucose, also anaerobic, also short lasting, so lasts about 2 to 3 minutes. In the same legal state analogy, think of like a individual that's legal age and a legal state dropping a tincture under their tongue, so it's going to be pretty fast acting still, and it's going to last a little bit longer than, say, puffing on a joint. In oxidative phosphorylation, last but certainly not least, the method of producing ATP within a myofiber. We can use byproduct of glycolysis to produce ATP, so pyruvic acid, fatty acid, amino acid, nucleotide. So there's 32 to 34 ATP produced per 1 nutrient. So it's crazy ATP production, but it is oxidative phosphorylation is aerobic, so oxygen is required. Oxygen is the limiting factor. Without oxygen, none of this takes place. But with oxygen, we can pretty much produce endless ATP. So think of oxidative phosphorylation as kind of like in a legal state, somebody of legal age eating an edible. It takes longest to kick in, but it also lasts the longest. So the creatine phosphate system is like the joint. The glycolysis is like the tincture under the tongue. Fast acting, lasts a little bit longer than the joint. Edible takes the longest to kick in, but it also lasts the longest. That's the oxidative phosphorylation. So there's 3 methods of ATP production within, myofiber: creatine phosphate system, aka phosphagen system, glycolysis, oxidative phosphorylation. And whenever you go get the massage, get your gift card at the massage, there's a scientific reason behind it. More blood, more oxygen, less pyruvic acid, less lactic acid. Thank oxygen for ATP production, but also thank not oxygen, I guess, for ATP production with creatine phosphate and glycolysis. But I mean, without oxidative phosphorylation, our energy levels are just being depleted. But thank you, oxygen.